Officer Melad Tilko's body cam captured the end of a high-speed chase that spanned 2 cities and 3 highways. At 6:07 p.m. on February 25, 2025, Richard Leyva's black Hyundai Sonata crashed into 2 vehicles on North Mollison Avenue in El Cajon, California. The driver attempted to squeeze between stopped cars. He failed. The Sonata's front end collapsed against both vehicles. Officers pulled Leyva from the wreckage. He resisted. A taser dropped him to the pavement. When officers opened the trunk, they found what they'd been chasing: the body of 51-year-old Jamison Webster. Webster's body showed signs of trauma. Her neck bore marks consistent with strangulation. She'd been dead for hours, possibly more than a day. The trunk smelled of decomposition. Officers secured the scene. The medical examiner was called. Homicide detectives arrived within 30 minutes. Her name was Jamison Webster, 51 years old, a mother of 2 sons. She'd dedicated her life to her children, especially Richard, who'd struggled with mental illness for years. She'd stood by him through psychiatric hospitalizations, court appearances, and countless crises. Friends described her as kind, resilient, endlessly devoted. She lived for her boys. On the evening of February 24th, Webster had driven to the Motel 6 on Montrose Court in El Cajon. Richard was staying there. She planned to drop off food and check on him. She never made it home. Her other son, Xavier Leyva, had been the one to find her. 24 hours after she'd left to see Richard, Xavier went to the motel. He saw his mother's Hyundai Sonata in the parking lot. He saw Richard. He tried to open the trunk. Richard slammed it closed. Xavier opened it again. Richard slammed it shut, again and again. Finally, Xavier shoved his brother aside. He activated the trunk release from inside the car. The trunk opened. His mother's body lay inside. Xavier called 911 immediately. Richard jumped into the driver's seat. He reversed the car with Xavier standing at the open door. The car struck Xavier, dragging him briefly before he fell clear. Richard fled. Police responded within minutes. They spotted the Sonata near Madison and Magnolia Avenues. Richard refused to stop. The chase began. For the next 20 minutes, Richard Leyva led officers on a pursuit through El Cajon and Spring Valley. He ran red lights. He drove onto center medians to avoid traffic. He weaved into oncoming lanes. The chase spanned State Route 94, State Route 125, and eastbound Interstate 8. His mother's body was in the trunk the entire time. Richard tried to squeeze between 2 stopped vehicles. He crashed. Officers tasered him. They opened the trunk. Jamison Webster was dead. She'd been strangled in Richard's motel room. Her body had been photographed, dragged, hidden, driven across 2 cities at high speed in a desperate attempt to evade what Richard knew was coming. Justice. At 3:47 p.m. on February 24th, 2025, Jamison Webster pulled into the parking lot of the Motel 6 on Montrose Court. Surveillance cameras captured her arrival. She parked her black Hyundai Sonata. She grabbed bags from the passenger seat, food for Richard, supplies he'd asked for. She walked to room 118. Richard had checked into the motel that same day. He'd been released from a mental health facility just hours earlier, checked himself in, then checked himself out the same day. His mother didn't know this. She only knew he needed help. He always needed help. Webster entered the motel room at 3:52 p.m. She left briefly at 4:10 p.m. Surveillance shows her returning to her car. She retrieved more items. She went back inside. At 7:03 p.m., the motel's parking lot was quiet. At 7:12 p.m., Richard Leyva took photographs of his mother's body with his cell phone. The images were later recovered by detectives. 5 photographs, taken over the span of 5 minutes. Jamison Webster was already dead. The cause of death would later be determined as strangulation. The attack had occurred inside the motel room. No one heard screaming. No one called for help. Richard's room was on the ground floor, tucked in a corner of the property. No witnesses. A motel security guard would later testify that he saw Richard around 2 a.m. on February 25th. Richard was in the parking lot, holding a woman upright against a car. The guard asked if Richard needed help. Richard said the woman had fainted. She'd be fine. The guard left. Surveillance footage from 2:04 a.m. tells a different story. Richard is captured dragging his mother's body out of the motel room. He grabs her by the ankles. Her head drags across the pavement. Her body is limp, lifeless. He drags her to the Hyundai Sonata. He opens the trunk. He lifts her body, awkwardly, struggling with the weight, and places her inside. He closes the trunk. He goes back inside the motel room. For the next 15 hours, Jamison Webster's body remained in the trunk of her own car, parked outside her killer's motel room. Xavier Leyva grew concerned when his mother didn't return home. She'd said she was dropping off food. She'd be back by evening. 24 hours passed. No word. Xavier knew where Richard was staying. He drove to the Motel 6. Surveillance cameras captured Xavier's arrival at 4:43 p.m. on February 25th. He brought a friend. They approached Richard, who was outside the motel room. Xavier asked where their mother was. Richard said she'd let him borrow the car. She'd taken an Uber to a friend's house. Xavier didn't believe him. Xavier walked to the Hyundai Sonata. He opened the driver's side door. He reached inside and activated the trunk release. The trunk began to open. Richard slammed it shut with one hand. Xavier opened it again. Richard slammed it closed. The struggle continued for several seconds. Xavier, desperate and confused, kept activating the trunk release. Richard kept slamming it shut. Finally, Xavier shoved Richard aside. The trunk stayed open. Xavier saw his mother. Her body was curled in the trunk, her face pale, her eyes closed. A physical fight erupted. Xavier attacked Richard. They fought across the parking lot for several minutes. Surveillance captured every moment. During the fight, Richard said, "Calm down. You don't need to call the cops." Xavier broke free. He ran toward the motel office to call 911. Richard sprinted to the Hyundai. He got into the driver's seat. Xavier was still near the open driver's door. Richard threw the car into reverse. The car struck Xavier. He was dragged several feet before falling clear. He was not seriously injured. Richard fled. Xavier called 911 at 4:47 p.m. Police were notified immediately. A bolo was issued for the black Hyundai Sonata. License plate number provided. Suspect description: Richard Anthony Leyva, 24 years old, possibly armed, fleeing with the body of his mother in the trunk. Officers spotted the Sonata at 5:51 p.m. near Madison and Magnolia Avenues in El Cajon. They attempted a traffic stop. Richard accelerated. The chase began. Officers pursued the Hyundai Sonata through residential streets, onto highways, and back into surface traffic. Richard ran red lights at intersections. He drove onto the center median to bypass stopped cars. He swerved into oncoming lanes on State Route 94. The pursuit covered multiple jurisdictions. El Cajon police coordinated with Spring Valley units. CHP monitored from above. At 6:05 p.m., Richard exited Interstate 8 onto North Mollison Avenue. Traffic ahead was stopped. Two vehicles blocked the road. Richard attempted to squeeze the Sonata between them. He crashed. The Sonata's front end crumpled. Steam hissed from the radiator. Richard tried to exit the vehicle. Officers surrounded him immediately. He resisted. Officer Melad Tilko deployed his taser. Richard went down. Officers handcuffed him at 6:07 p.m. One officer approached the rear of the Sonata. He popped the trunk. Jamison Webster's body was inside. Detectives secured the scene. The Sonata was impounded as evidence. Forensic teams photographed the trunk, the interior, the exterior. Blood was found on the rear seats. Fibers were collected. The trunk liner showed signs of prolonged contact with a human body. Xavier Leyva was interviewed at the scene. He provided a detailed account of finding his mother's body. He described the confrontation with Richard. He described being struck by the car. He was cooperative, shaken, grieving. El Cajon police detective Nicholas Sorello led the homicide investigation. He obtained surveillance footage from the Motel 6. The footage showed Jamison Webster arriving on February 24th. It showed her entering Richard's room. It showed Richard dragging her body out at 2 a.m. Detectives obtained a warrant for Richard's cell phone. The phone contained 5 photographs of Jamison Webster's body. The metadata showed the photos were taken between 7:12 p.m. and 7:17 p.m. on February 24th, shortly after she'd entered his motel room. The motel security guard was interviewed. He confirmed seeing Richard with a woman around 2 a.m. on February 25th. He said Richard claimed the woman had fainted. The guard had not realized the woman was dead. Detectives searched Richard's motel room. Blood evidence was found on the floor. Bedding was collected. A pillow showed signs of being used to muffle sounds or apply pressure. The medical examiner conducted an autopsy on February 26th. Cause of death: strangulation. Manner of death: homicide. Petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes. Bruising on the neck. Hyoid bone fracture. Jamison Webster had been manually strangled. Detectives reviewed Richard's criminal history. He had prior arrests for assault, elder abuse, and carrying a concealed weapon. In 2021, he'd been diagnosed with acute psychosis and an unspecified bipolar disorder. He'd been placed in a mental health diversion program. His mother had supported him throughout. She'd written letters to the court on his behalf. She testified to his progress. Court records showed Jamison Webster had been present at nearly every hearing. She'd advocated for her son. She'd believed in his recovery. On February 24th, 2025, Richard had checked himself into a mental health facility. He checked himself out the same day. Hours later, his mother arrived at his motel room. She never left alive. The case was solved within hours. Richard Leyva was in custody. The body was recovered. Surveillance footage documented the crime. Cell phone photos confirmed premeditation. Witness testimony placed him at the scene. There was no mystery, no cold case period, no breakthrough needed. Richard Leyva had killed his mother, photographed her body, dragged her to the trunk of her car, and attempted to flee when his brother discovered the truth. Detectives built their case methodically. They cataloged every piece of evidence: surveillance footage from the motel, cell phone data, photographs of the body, forensic analysis of the trunk, witness statements from Xavier Leyva and the motel security guard, blood evidence from the motel room. On February 27, 2025, prosecutors charged Richard Anthony Leyva with first-degree murder, assault with a deadly weapon, and evading law enforcement. The murder charge carried special circumstances. The victim was Richard's mother. California law treats the murder of a parent as an aggravating factor. Richard faced 28 years and 8 months to life in prison. Detectives also uncovered Richard's history of violence. In July 2021, he'd assaulted an elderly man walking a dog, punching the man in the face without provocation. Later that same day, he'd chased another man through a parking lot, stalking him with a knife. Deputies had found Richard standing in the middle of the street, hands in his pockets, staring blankly. He'd been unresponsive to commands. He'd been charged with elder abuse and assault. He'd pleaded not guilty. While in custody, he'd received his bipolar diagnosis. He'd been released into a mental health diversion program in December 2021. His mother had attended the hearing. She'd written a letter to the court. Richard is close with his family and friends now. He has an extremely positive attitude and wants nothing more than to live a productive, healthy lifestyle. She'd believed in him. 3 years later, he strangled her. Mike Webster, Jamison's ex-husband and Richard's stepfather, spoke to reporters after the arrest. He said they'd called police on Richard multiple times over the years. They'd removed knives from their apartment out of fear. He said Richard had always been a little off. Mike Webster said one officer had warned them, "If you don't get help, somebody's going to die." Jamison had tried. She'd gotten Richard into treatment programs. She'd attended every court date. She'd advocated for him. She'd stood by him. On February 24, 2025, she drove to his motel room to drop off food. She was trying to help. Richard Anthony Leyva was arrested at 6:07 p.m. on February 25, 2025, at the scene of the crash on North Mollison Avenue. He was taken into custody after being subdued with a taser. He was transported to El Cajon Police Department headquarters, then booked into San Diego County Jail. He was charged with first-degree murder, assault with a deadly weapon, and evading a peace officer. Richard said nothing during the arrest. He refused to answer questions. He requested an attorney. On February 28th, Richard appeared in court for his arraignment. He pleaded not guilty to all charges. Deputy District Attorney Yasmin Bigdeli outlined the evidence against him. Surveillance footage showing him dragging his mother's body. Cell phone photographs taken shortly after the murder. Witness testimony from Xavier Leyva. Forensic evidence from the motel room and the vehicle. Bigdeli stated there was clear evidence of strangulation. The medical examiner had confirmed manual strangulation as the cause of death. Richard's attorney did not dispute the evidence, but indicated that Richard's mental health history would be a factor in his defense. Court documents revealed Richard had been diagnosed with acute psychosis and bipolar disorder in 2021. He'd been hospitalized multiple times. He'd been on medication, but compliance was inconsistent. The judge ordered Richard held without bail. He posed a danger to the community. He'd killed his mother. He'd fled from police. He'd struck his brother with a car during his escape. A preliminary hearing was scheduled for September 2025. At that hearing, surveillance footage was played in court. Prosecutors walked through the timeline. Jamison arriving at the motel. Richard dragging her body to the trunk. Xavier discovering the body. The fight. The chase. The crash. El Cajon police detective John Duong testified about the cell phone photographs. He described the images. 5 photos of Jamison Webster's lifeless body, taken between 7:12 p.m. and 7:17 p.m. on February 24th, within an hour of her entering the motel room. The motel security guard testified. He said he'd seen Richard with a woman around 2 a.m. The woman appeared unconscious. Richard said she'd fainted. The guard believed him. Detective Nicholas Sorello testified about Xavier's discovery of the body. He described the confrontation between the brothers. He described Richard's attempt to prevent Xavier from opening the trunk. He described Richard's statement, "Calm down, you don't need to call the cops." Officer Melad Tilko testified about the pursuit. He described Richard running red lights, driving onto medians, weaving into oncoming traffic, crashing into stopped vehicles. The judge found sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. Richard remained in custody without bail. His trial was scheduled for 2026. As of December 2025, Richard Anthony Leyva remains in San Diego County Jail, awaiting trial. He has pleaded not guilty to all charges. His defense attorneys have indicated they will argue diminished capacity due to his mental health history. If convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances, Richard faces 28 years and 8 months to life in prison. Xavier Leyva has not spoken publicly since the preliminary hearing. Friends say he is grieving privately. The loss of his mother. The betrayal by his brother. Jamison Webster's friends organized a fundraiser to cover her funeral costs. More than $10,000 was raised. A memorial service was held in March 2025. Friends described Jamison as a woman who loved fiercely, who fought for her children, who never gave up. One friend, Karen Saunders, said she'd spoken with Jamison days before her death. They'd talked about their children, about Richard's struggles with mental illness. Saunders had told Jamison, "We can't give up on our kids." Saunders now wishes she'd said something different. "Maybe I should have told her, don't try. Let him go. Maybe she'd still be here." Mike Webster, Jamison's ex-husband, said the family had seen warning signs for years. Richard's violence, his instability, his threats. They'd called police multiple times. They'd removed weapons from their home. One officer had warned them, "If you don't get help, somebody's going to die." Jamison had tried to get help. She'd stood by Richard through hospitalizations, court dates, and treatment programs. She'd believed in his recovery. On February 24th, 2025, she brought him food at a motel. He killed her. He photographed her body. He dragged her to the trunk of her car. He hid her there for 15 hours. When his brother discovered the truth, Richard tried to flee. He struck Xavier with the car. He led police on a 20-minute chase with his mother's body in the trunk. The chase ended on North Mollison Avenue. Officers tasered him. They opened the trunk. Jamison Webster was 51 years old. She loved her sons. She tried to help. It wasn't enough.